So I'm joined here with Mike Pacino of Boys Ranch. So tell me a little bit about, we're here with High Plains history. So tell me a little bit about, first off, how did Boys Ranch get started with Cal Farley's?
Well, it got started because Cal Farley had been through the panhandle of Texas when he was wrestling after World War One. But you got to back up all the way to find out why Cal Farley started that. He was born in 1895. He and his twin sister Zaida on Christmas Day, 1895, and he was born on a farm in northern Iowa, and the family moved to southern Minnesota to another farm. And of course, Cal Farley and his brothers had to work the farm, which he wasn't real crazy about standing behind a plow back then. But he was quite an athlete. He wasn't very big in stature, but he was a good athlete, and he was a very good wrestler. But he loved baseball. So he would run 10 miles after getting all of his farm chores done to go play in a farmer's field baseball with a bunch of friends. Well, a scout from the Northern Minnesota Twilight League saw him playing and offered him a contract to go play in northern Minnesota. He was 16 years of age in northern Minnesota to play semi-pro baseball. Cal loved it. He was a second baseman. He was good. But World War I came along, and Cal joined the Army and was stationed in France, and then, of course, when the war was over, in Germany. And like any other time when there was a world war, they did not do the Olympics. So the Army and all of the allies got together, and they had what were called the Inter-Allied Games to take the place of the Olympics. Well, Cal was quite a wrestler. So he went into wrestling. He went 122 matches in a row without a loss and won the world championship of the Inter-Allied League in welterweight. So after World War I was over, Cal still played baseball in Minnesota, and then in the off season he wrestled. And one of his wrestling trips took him to El Paso, and he met Dutch Mantell, who became a lifelong friend of his. He was also a wrestler. But on the way back, the train stopped in Amarillo, Texas, a little dusty town with about 15,000 people. And Cal actually liked the area. I have no idea what Amarillo looked like in 1919, but Cal thought it was pretty nice. Well, he went back up and he continued to wrestle and he continued to play baseball. Well, one day the manager of the team he played for there out of Minneapolis told him that, the pitchers had gotten better and the players had gotten bigger, and Cal was only 5'2", and told him he might want to try to find a different place to play ball. So Cal asked about coming to Amarillo and playing for the Amarillo Gassers. In 1923, he moved to Amarillo and played for the Amarillo Gassers, and he also wrestled in the off season. Well, the Amarillo Gassers only lasted 1 year, and they went bankrupt. But they also owned a little tire store. And Cal had made enough friends in Amarillo at that time to get backing to purchase this tire store from the Amarillo Gassers. And it was a B.F. Goodrich tire store. So Cal Farley started that business. While in that business and while playing baseball, he met Mimi Fincher. And 1 year later married her. That was Mimi Farley. That was his wife for 43 years. But Cal wanted to grow this business, and he still loved baseball. Even though the Gassers were gone, another team came along, and he would still go to the baseball games. Well, during that time period, there were a lot, the oil business had really grown in the Texas Panhandle, and there were a lot of families that were kind of torn apart because the husbands would go off to these oil companies to find work, and they weren't at home. And the mom was sitting there with all these kids, and the boys especially would quit school, start running the streets, getting into trouble. The juvenile crime rate in Amarillo soared during the 20s and early 30s. And Cal was really worried about that. So he had it in his heart that they needed to do something. And in 1934, he and some other folks Ralph Dykeman started the Maverick Boys Club, and then incorporated Kids Inc. in with that. And that took care of about 90% of those kids. There were still 10% of those kids that were running the streets in the evenings and really had no place to go. They were homeless. But before we get to that point, let me back up a little bit, because in 1929, Cal took his business model way forward. B.F. Goodrich was a great tire. But Cal knew, with all of the oil business that was happening, oil and gas business was happening in the Texas Panhandle, he wanted all that business. So he contacted B.F. Goodrich, told him of his idea to promote their tires. They agreed to do it. Now, I can't imagine why they would do this. Cal got with all the newspapers and invited everybody to come out to the little Amarillo airfield. He was going to drop B.F. Goodrich tire, inflated with air, on a wire rim from 2,700 feet, hit a target in the middle of the airfield, and he was guaranteeing that this tire was going to survive this fall. I don't know how you do that. And he didn't know that's what it was going to survive it. He took this chance. The pilot took it up. There were hundreds of people, and businessmen from the oil companies and all the businessmen from Amarillo were there. And they dropped that tire from 2,700 feet, and they hit the target. It hit and bounced 200 feet in the air, came back and landed on the ground. Photographers went out there. Cal went out there. Of course, the B.F. Goodrich people went out there. The tire was still inflated. The rim was bent. Of course, there were tube tires back then. But it survived, and Cal's business exploded. And he not only had the tire business, he opened that thing up to what would almost be a small Walmart. He was selling all kinds of supplies, food items, clothing. He even had a radio program, 15 minutes per day from 11:45 to 12, where he did the Cal Farley show. And everybody listened to it, because if you didn't listen to it, you were going to miss the day he was talking about you. So everybody said that, we have to watch this. We have to listen to this radio program. So everybody did. It was very successful. Started about 1926 and went all the way to 1941, 15 years. So in the 30s, we had the Great Depression, and there was even more dads that were out of the picture at that point. And the problems with kids was getting pretty bad, especially in Amarillo. So Cal got with rancher Julian Bivens, who was a friend of his, and he told him, he said, I need a small piece of property out in the country that I can get this bottom 10% of boys that are not being helped by the Maverick Club, Kids Inc. They need to get out of this inner city environment, get out in the country. And Bivens said, well, I've got a piece of property. Let me show you. Now, Julian Bivens at that time owned what is now the LIT, the Lit Ranch, 70,000 acres. And on the southwest corner of the Lit Ranch was the old ghost town of Tascosa, Texas. Julian Bivens jumped into his car with Cal Farley, Chancellor Weymouth, and Ralph Dykeman, and they drove out to the river, Canadian River. There was no bridge. Bridge didn't come along until 1955. So they drove out there not really knowing if they could ford the river. Nobody has any idea, especially back then, whether it rained in New Mexico and the river was a mile wide, you couldn't cross it. But they got there and they were able to cross that creek. They got into Old Tascosa, and the Bivens family in the 20s had taken the old courthouse, which had closed in 1915, took the old courthouse and made it kind of their western headquarters. They had run natural gas down from Channing. They had their own water system. They had a septic system. They put a kitchen in and a bathroom in. And Julian took Cal Farley up there and showed him the building, and they stood out there on the steps, and of course they were looking to the south and out to the east and west, and they saw some of the old crumbling buildings of Old Tascosa still standing. But Julian asked him what he thought. Cal Farley said, it's perfect. It's perfect. And that was March 1939. Boys Ranch became incorporated in March 1939. So that's the beginning of Boys Ranch. And the first kids, there were 9 boys that Cal Farley brought out. And they were the first 9 boys there. In fact, in the old courthouse, there's a painting painted by one of the first 9 boys, Alvis Grant, of the first 9 boys sitting on the steps of the courthouse.
That's just fascinating. So you talk about him being a wrestler. I want to talk about something a little bit kind of extended to that. What's the connection between him and Dory Funk Sr.? Because I know Dory Funk Sr. did a little bit of stuff out there at Boys Ranch as well.
He was the ranch superintendent from 48 to 51.
So tell me a little bit about how that kind of started, that relationship with them, and how he became the superintendent.
Well, Cal and all of the wrestlers in the Texas Panhandle were really good friends. I mean, Cal had really promoted wrestling in the Texas Panhandle when he came to live in Amarillo, and of course Ralph Dykeman was Dutch Mantell was a wrestler, and lots of sports figures had come out to Amarillo to see what Cal and Dutch Mantell were doing. Well, Dory Funk was a wrestler. In fact, he became a world champion wrestler. Well, he and Cal were good friends. Well, from 1939 to 1947, Cal had a couple of ranch superintendents. That's what he called the men who ran the ranch itself. Were over the people who took care of the kids. In fact, they helped take care of the kids too. But in 47, you got to know what happened just prior to 1947. In 1943, there was an article written called Alley Cowboys, and it came out in the Saturday Evening Post. MGM officials and producers from Hollywood got a hold of that article, and they contacted Cal Farley and said, we'd like to do a movie called Boys Ranch out there at Old Tascosa. And Cal said, that'd be great. Well, they came out there, they shot this movie. Cal made some money off of it and used it to buy some buildings from the old Army Air Base in Dalhart to move down to Boys Ranch for schools, for living quarters. But what that did, that movie went national. All of a sudden, Cal Farley wasn't just trying to find a place for inner city kids from Amarillo to live. He was getting requests from New York, Miami, Dallas, Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco. He knew he couldn't turn these kids down. So Boys Ranch had to grow. And in 47, it had grown enough kids that it was getting a little hard to handle. Well, Dory Funk was a big fella. He was a wrestler. His two boys were Terry and Dory Funk Jr., of course, came out to live with them when they lived at Boys Ranch. And he was brought in to kind of help gather this all together and get it back into line, because there were so many new kids that come out there that it got to be a handful. I mean, a real handful. They couldn't get enough people to go to work out there. It's kind of like now. We're still 40 miles out in the country. For people to come to work from Amarillo, it's an 80-mile round trip. But back then, there wasn't even a paved road. So he had to have a strong person there at the helm of Boys Ranch. And his friend Dory Funk filled that in there for 3 years, a little over 3 years.
Now I heard that this is a story I've heard. This is something that I've heard about Dory Funk Sr. when he was a superintendent out there. He wanted to make sure the boys were kind of, whether it was football or wrestling, because I wasn't he the one that introduced kind of football and wrestling into Boys Ranch? That's what I've heard.
Cal had already introduced wrestling. I mean, he was a wrestler, and he loved wrestling. But by bringing in, Cal didn't live out at the ranch. He lived in Amarillo. He was running Boys Ranch from Amarillo. He needed Dory Funk out there living there. And yes, with him living there, then the wrestling program took off. And of course, it's still strong today. Our wrestling program has been really strong. For a little old bitty 1, 2, and 3A school over the years, we got one state title, and you're not wrestling against other 1, 2, or 3A schools. You're wrestling against every school in the state of Texas. And we've got a state title from the 60s. We got second place in 1994, I believe. Tascosa took number 1. We took number 2 in the state. Tascosa is quite a bit bigger than Boys Ranch, quite a bit.
But I've heard this story that Dory Funk kind of wanted to make sure that the boys were too tired to cause trouble out there at Boys Ranch, that by making them work out, and then making sure, of course, they did their chores out there. So he wanted to make sure they were too tired to cause trouble.
Well, Cal's idea of moving those kids from inner city Amarillo out in the country is still working today. You remove those kids from the environment they're in that's causing a lot of their issues, and you move them out into the country, into a wholesome environment. We're a small town environment now, and that does a large percentage of your work for you just in making that move. And then you start working with our programs now. Same thing back then. They'd get a kid out there. Now, again, they got a little overwhelmed. They brought in way too many kids too fast, And yeah, Dory had to do something. And one of the things he did is like what you said, the kids would work and they were sawing lumber, they were helping build buildings, they were farming, they were taking care of animals. They were tired. They went to bed at night. They did the laundry, they helped with the cooking, they had to do everything.
And so talk to me a little bit about how, so when does, I guess, the school district kind of start out there? Was that an immediate thing, or was that kind of later on?
It started in the 40s. I believe it was, oh, you're going to catch me, but I'm going to believe it's like 46 that we became an independent school district in the state of Texas. We did not become accredited for 12th grade. I don't think we had a full graduation until 1956, but we were an accredited school before that. When Boys Ranch started, the Oldham County Schoolhouse, which is the oldest standing adobe schoolhouse in the state of Texas, was still operating. And that's where our kids went to begin with, was right behind the courthouse is where that old school sits. And it operated all the way in 1955. The county closed it in 55, and Boys Ranch, the United Peace Officers of America, had formed in 1953 to generate the funds to build Boys Ranch a new school. And they built what's now the Boys Ranch High School. Back then it was just the Boys Ranch School. And in fact, over the door, etched in the stone, it says, "A tribute to the Peace Officers of America." But we had our own school, a stone schoolhouse that's still standing out there that was built in 1955. But we had been accredited before that. But some of our kids were going to the old Oldham County Schoolhouse. And then when we bought some of the buildings from the Dalhart Army Air Base, one of those was converted into a schoolhouse, and some of the kids were over there.
And so talk to me a little about, I guess, the importance of, having, this be, incorporated and then have a school district out there, and just like you said, kind of the small town feel out there to where it's a community out there, Boys Ranch. I've of course gone out to Boys Ranch for the Boys Ranch Rodeo, which we can talk about here in a little bit, but just kind of have a small town feel out there to where these kids can be nurtured and also just loved on.
Well, I've been out there almost 38 years, and I've known people who had started out there in the 50s, early 50s, and I worked with them when I first came to work. And the premise of Boys Ranch is that it is a wholesome environment for these kids, and it is a small town. In fact, we are a town in the state of Texas. There's highway signs and everything else telling you how far it is to Boys Ranch. We also are listed as a town in the Texas. We have our own post office and our own zip code, which is pretty unusual for a child care facility. We're sitting on 12,000 acres. So our kids that come to us, they're involved in so many things that we have what's called our ELP program, which is everything from wood shop, welding, culinary, leather shop, 3D printing, rocketry, robotics, vocational mechanics, farm and ranch, feedlot maintenance. It's all there. And the kids, and that's in addition to sports and school and our chapel activities that kids are going to Camp Alfie this evening. There's so much going on. It's kind of like when Dory Funk was there. The kids are pretty tired by the end of the day. It's still pretty much the same philosophy. You give these kids wholesome activities to do. You give them a safe environment, and that's key. That's key. Our kids don't come from safe environments. Inner city environments are not safe. Sometimes the family situation isn't safe, sometimes. And when they come to Boys Ranch, that's one of the first things they figure out is they're safe. And once you start feeling safe, you start getting involved in things. There's nobody trying to take advantage of you. There's nobody on the corner trying to sell drugs. There's nobody else trying to get you to go out and vandalize anything. You are in a wholesome environment and you feel safe. You get involved. You get involved in sports, football, wrestling, basketball, track, cross country, tennis, baseball, rodeo. But that philosophy is the same as it was back then. we're a little more sophisticated. No, we're a lot more sophisticated with our neurotraining and knowing what happens to children at birth that are raised in a certain situation. You know how the brain develops, and I know that that's making a big impact in what we're doing with kids now because we understand where they're coming from. But the original premise is still there. You get them out of that inner city, out of that bad environment, get them in a safe place where they can get involved in everything they want to get involved in. I know my personal kids were involved in so much stuff I rarely ever saw them, and we lived out there. But in a lot of cases, these kids are so involved that they're too tired to get in trouble.
So talk to me a little bit about the Boys Ranch Rodeo. I mean, that is a staple at Boys Ranch, and a staple here on the High Plains where people go out there and make a weekend of it.
Right.
So talk to me a little bit about, I guess, how that got started and what the idea was behind the Boys Ranch Rodeo.
Of course, being out in the country, being on a ranch, having animals that farmers and ranchers in the area had given to Boys Ranch. Cal had built a small arena not far from right where the headquarters is now, between the headquarters and our medical clinic, but it was right out there as you drove in, right off to the right. And in the early 40s, the kids would go out there. He would go out there, and they'd put calves in a chute, and kids would get on them, tie a rope around them, and ride out. Well, Cal Farley decided in 1945 what he was going to do was we're going to use this to promote Boys Ranch. We are now national. We don't need just kids coming in from all over the country. We need funds coming in from all over the country to help support this thing. And the rodeo, he thought, would be a good way to get started, promote Boys Ranch. So in 45, they had their first official. And I know a lot of people are saying, you're calling this your 81st and it's 2025. Mathematicians will tell you your first year started in 1945, not in 1946. So it is our 81st annual rodeo. But Cal invited anybody who wanted to come. Problem was, you got to remember, there was no bridge across the Canadian River. People came in, and a lot more people than Cal Farley expected. We're talking hundreds of cars drove out. It's a 4.5-hour trip back then on a dirt road to get to the river. When they got to the river, the rodeo was getting ready to start. They all thought they had about an hour to go. But one at a time, 200, 300 cars couldn't get pulled across that river fast enough. It had swollen. And again, that has nothing to do with what happens in the Texas Panhandle. It has everything to do with what happens in New Mexico. And so they had no idea the river was going to swell like it did. Well, the rodeo was over, and you still had 100 and some odd cars back on the south side of the river that didn't get to the rodeo. So Cal knew he had something there because all those people came that he didn't expect to come. In fact, one of the ranchers went up to one of the kids. This was caught by a reporter that was there at the rodeo and said, "You think Cal oversold this thing a little bit, son?" And so after that, I mean, it was sold, but it was. I'm sure he gave more time. Said, if you're going to be coming out, you got to come out early enough. We'll have some other activities going on, but we got to get everybody across the river. So every rodeo after that just got a little bigger, a little bigger, and a little bigger. Of course, when the bridge came in 1955, that made all the difference in the world. Now, in 1949, Roy Rogers came out. Remember, I told you the movie was made in 45. After the movie was made, Hollywood people started kind of getting interested in what was happening out in the Texas Panhandle with this little boys ranch. And Roy Rogers and Dale Evans came out. They came out to be a part of our rodeo in 1949. There's no way in the world we were going to be able to handle all the people who wanted to come out and see Roy Rogers and Dale Evans, so the rodeo was held in Amarillo. 15,000 people came to that rodeo because of Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. Of course, to see the kids too, but 15,000 had never come out, nowhere near that had come out to the rodeo before. But Roy and Dale stayed strong partners of Boys Ranch all the way until 1979 when he started getting ill. And at that point, he couldn't make that trip out there anymore. But there is a really cool story with Roy Rogers. In 1955, Roy paid to have all the boys and the staff that could come with him get on the train at the Boys Ranch Depot right on the south side of the river and go all the way out to Southern California to be at his ranch in Apple Valley to be a part of his shooting of the Roy Rogers Western shows. But at the same time, he took them out to Disneyland. First year Disneyland was open, 1955.
Wow.
And those boys were met at the gate by Walt Disney. And they were allowed to go in an hour earlier than anybody else. But they said that Walt Disney was standing on a milk crate welcoming all the boys and staff from Boys Ranch.
That's so cool.
A couple hundred boys and probably 40 or 50 staff, if there was that many, I can't remember. But they all went to Disneyland. Then they came back, and some of them were allowed to be extras on Roy Rogers' Western show.
Very cool.
Yeah, really cool.
So it just, and it's still something that you have to, like when the Boys Ranch Rodeo happens, you still got to get there early. You still got to get there early to get a good parking spot and,
right.
and everything like that. So
we tried to make it a little easier. We park everybody out there in what we call our cemetery pasture, and we shuttle everybody in. They can walk if they want to, but because it's at most an eighth of a mile, but we'll shuttle everybody in that wants to come to the rodeo. And then, of course, at 10 o'clock, the Fall Fest starts. And that's for families, kids, adults. It can tie you up for a couple hours. At the same time, we've got food trucks all over out there that people can buy their meals, because the rodeo's free. The Fall Fest and rodeo is free. You just buy your meal from whatever food truck you want. The rodeo starts at 2:30 and goes on until it's finished, whenever that is. This year it's going to be on October the 18th. Historically it's always been on Labor Day weekend. Last year we moved it to October the 8th because of the heat, right?
Yeah.
Remember what happened? Labor Day weekend, it was in the high 70s. October the 8th, it was 94 degrees. So it kind of backfired on us. So we moved it to the October the 18th this year. So what's going to wind up happening on October the 18th?
Maybe it'll be warm. Maybe it'll
going
be
to snow. No, I'm just kidding. It's not going to snow. Everybody come on out. But it's easy to get to. It's going to be not hot this year. It's a great weekend to come out. And it doesn't just end on Saturday. On Sunday, we have what we call our rodeo chapel service. And then we have a luncheon after that. So for those folks who want to come back out and stay and be a part of our rodeo chapel program and a luncheon, they're welcome to.
And so something else that always fascinates me about Boys Ranch is you guys have a cemetery out there. So I want to talk a little bit about the cemetery. That's always been a fascinating part for when you come into Boys Ranch and you see that cemetery out there. I don't really know anything about the cemetery out there. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, when I first moved out there, when I first went to work for Boys Ranch in 87, there were only 12 burials in that cemetery. There's now 179. It was designed for our alumni families, and for staff and staff families. So many of our alumni were raised out at Boys Ranch, and they don't know any other home. That's the only home they've ever known. And they want to be buried at home. They want to come back to their hometown to be buried. And we have a file that's hundreds and hundreds of applications thick of alumni that want to be buried out there. And my wife and I are going to be buried out there. It's our home. I mean, I've been out there 38 years, and that's our home. And our kids that have grown up out there, that's their home. And if you go on about half to 2/3 of our alumni on their Facebook accounts and look and see what their hometown listing is, it's Boys Ranch. So that cemetery it's called the Boys Ranch Alumni Cemetery. The Alumni Association sends funds every year, because we don't charge the alumni and their families or anybody for opening and closing. The only thing that they're responsible for is the headstone. That's it. Everything else is taken care of by us, and that's usually funded through the Alumni Association. Boys Ranch has a very strong alumni association.
Yeah, we have an alumni here. That's Andy Justice,
Yes.
and he is always the MC at the Boys Ranch Rodeo.
Right.
So it's
I talked him into that, by the way.
Yeah, he's very passionate about Boys Ranch, and he talks about Boys Ranch all the time.
Andy was 14 when we moved out to Boys Ranch, and my family was associated with his home, Weigel Home. And so we were there. We ate lunch with them every day. I covered that home when the house parents were off. And yeah, Andy and some of his best friends are kids that he grew up with there in that home. Now, I haven't heard whether he's wanting to be buried at Boys Ranch or not, but because Amarillo's been his home for a long time now.
Yeah, but he just talks about Boys Ranch and his love of Boys Ranch, and I know he's a big spokesperson.
I don't have to ask him, but I do every year to be the announcer at the rodeo, but he's always ready for it, always. He's never turned me down. He's never even said, dang, we got something else planned. I'll try to get out of it. He doesn't plan anything around it.
So talk to me. I know boys or Cal Farley. Some people at the Civic Center just know the Coliseum out there at the Civic Center, but it's actually called the Cal Farley's Coliseum. So talk to me a little bit about. You may not be able to touch on this, but maybe why is it named Cal Farley's Coliseum? Is it because of his work at Boys Ranch? Is it just because of his philanthropic style, or just all of that?
He was just being honored. I mean, Cal Farley has been honored in a lot of ways, and the city of Amarillo. Approached, of course, I think more than anything else, Cal Farley's son-in-law and his daughter, Jeannie Harriman and Sherm Harriman, were strong in Boys Ranch for 40, 50 years working and being a part of that. But they were also very big in Amarillo Theater, the Play Texas, things like that they were big in. And Cal Farley was huge in Amarillo, started a Rotary Club here, was president of the Rotary Club, was president of so many things, got an honorary doctorate degree from Texas Tech, and he was a humanitarian. Think about all the tens of thousands of kids that have come through Boys Ranch that honestly had no chance before they came to Boys Ranch. And I'm gonna tell you that just because of the ones that I know, which is most of them that have come through while I've been there, it's probably a 90% success rate. And I'm saying 90%. The 10% that may get into hot water and everything, usually they come back out of that and go, I know better than this, and turn their lives around. I know very few that have left there that haven't figured it out from what they've done at Boys Ranch. But I think the Cal Farley Coliseum was a tribute to Cal Farley from the city of Amarillo. There were still a lot of people in Amarillo, a lot of business people, bankers and oilmen and stuff that had been around when Cal Farley was here. He passed away in 1967. But a lot of those guys, when the Cal Farley Coliseum was dedicated, were still alive that were on his board of directors.
And so I guess for people who want to know more information about who Cal Farley was, what Boys Ranch does, how all of this came about for Boys Ranch, how can they do that, guys? I know you guys have a museum out there at Boys Ranch. So can they go there? Can they just, how can they do that?
Well, on our website, you can go on our website and you can request a tour, or you can just call out to Boys Ranch. Our number's listed. In fact, the Amarillo office is open Monday through Friday, and so is the office out at Boys Ranch. And you can call and request a tour, and they will forward you normally to me. And we do tours Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. But if there's a special request to do a tour on a weekend, if you give me enough notice where I'm not on the road somewhere, I will do the tours on the weekends. But it can be a full-on history tour. It can be just a Boys Ranch tour. A lot of people want to bring their bring a child out to say, this may be where we're going to apply. Now, that won't be a tour by me. That'll be a tour normally by somebody in our home life, the people who actually work directly with the kids will do that tour. But anybody that wants a tour, we do drop-ins. We'd rather you give us a little advance notice so that I'd like to be there and do the tour myself, but we've got a couple of other people that do. And all they have to do is they can either get online or just call our main number. And there's an 800 number also. Get online at calfarley.org, and you'll see an 800 number. But you can make that request there.
All right, Mike. Well, it's a pleasure talking to you. It's a pleasure it's always a pleasure to know there's people out here that want to share the history of the things that we may drive by or they see all the time, but we don't really know the history of.
I can do a 4-hour tour just on the history of Old Tascosa. So, a very wild town, one of the first 3 towns in the Texas Panhandle. In fact, I'm going to upset some folks in Mobile right now, but I believe we have the oldest standing structure in the Texas Panhandle on Boys Ranch property. It's not in Tascosa. It's 4 miles back on our ranch, but it's part of one of our ranch houses. It's adobe built in 1876.
All right. Well, if you go out to Boys Ranch and get that tour, you can see that.
That's right. You can. You can.
Well, Mike, thanks for joining us. Again, this is Jack Kessler for High Plains History.